Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the family of Rhogena Nicholas, we thank you for your time and interest in this issue. Today, what we're going to do is announce the preliminary findings as filed in court today by the legal team for the Nicholas family of their ongoing investigation. The investigation is incomplete, it's ongoing, but the legal team, led by Michael Doyle and Chuck Bourque here, will discuss the court filings, the status of the investigation, and Rhogena's brother, John, has joined us today. He's been integral in the process to find the truth of what's happened in the Harding Street raid. So we hope to have this completed in 30 to 40 minutes. We'll take questions afterwards. And there were some requests for some one-on-one interviews. We'll do those afterwards too if that's of interest. After Mike and Chuck address the status of the litigation, Hyde We and the folks from We That Organize are going to make some comments on their community activism on this issue. We will defer to them afterwards, and they'll have some comments as well. So with that, thanks again for being here, and Mike Doyle is next.
Thank you for your patience. First off, I want to thank the members of the Houston community, the Harris County community, the Texans, and certainly the folks back in Louisiana who have been so supportive of both the Nicholas and Tuttle family during this incredibly difficult journey, that at this point we have some important developments to share with you. We know now and have filed in the probate court here in Harris County with the assistance of Linda Burchett, a petition to ask the court, as allowed by Texas law, to take a next step that is very important to develop the facts about what really happened and what led to what happened at the Harding Street home January 28th of this year. The request to the court asked for the depositions of two of the senior managers in the narcotic division who were primarily responsible for what happened with Gerald Goins and other folks in Narcotic Squad 15, Lieutenant Marcia Todd and Captain Paul Follis. It also asked that the city be called to answer for certain of the developments. The reason the family has taken this step is because their investigation to date, especially with the assistance of a forensic scientist, Michael Maloney, who, as many of you knew, actually spent time over 4 days in May doing the job of a full scene examination to recover ballistics and other materials that were left there during the HPD investigation, has given us 4 particular developments that we want to share with you today. The first one is documented and confirmed by Michael Maloney in the petition filed today, is that the physical evidence does not line up with the city's story that Rhogena Nicholas was shot and killed in her home by an officer attempting to stop her from wresting a shotgun out of the hands of a police officer. What Michael Maloney has confirmed the physical evidence instead shows is that Rhogena Nicholas was shot by someone outside the house, firing through a wall where she could not be seen. And that's confirmed not just by the ballistics reconstruction, but by also DNA testing that corresponded the bullet recovered with what the Institute of Forensic Science of Harris County found during the autopsy. The second item is that something we'd already seen initially that caused the family to question the story that had been put out by the city was that in this case there was cell phone video by a neighbor. The story we all heard was that in this case there was a very quick gunfight in which Dennis Tuttle was firing at officers and Rhogena Nicholas was grappling with officers, and it was done very quickly. What we know now is that 30 minutes after the supposed big gun battle was done, there were 2 lone gunshots, and we have some physical evidence that indicates what that might be. The third item is that in this case there was actually gunshots. Somebody took a gun at some point, likely long after Dennis Tuttle was dead, at least based on the physical evidence, and went into an inside wall and fired 2 shots into a wall. That's also been documented by gunpowder residue physical chemical test directed by Mr. Maloney. And the fourth development is that we now know that while the police department was telling its citizens in the world repeatedly that this was a known drug house, a black tar heroin drug house run by Rhogena Nicholas and her husband, at the same time we now have internal documents that indicates while they were saying that, they had every reason to know that just was not true. I want to share with you now a little bit about what we all remember. In this case, we know that there was a very quick story by the city about this massive gunfire. You may recall Chief Acevedo, not just that night, but the next day at the hospital while the officers were receiving treatment, there was a very specific story we heard from the City of Houston Police Department that has never been corrected, in any way challenged, or as the family requested back in March before they made any public statement, just acknowledge the parts of this story about this husband and wife that weren't true. And it was a very specific story we heard.
You know, yesterday, about 4:30, shortly before 5 o'clock, narcotics officers from the Houston Police Department, from the Group 15, initiated a search warrant at the location that's the 800 block of Harding Street. Upon making entry, they immediately came under fire. The first officer through the door, armed with a shotgun, was charged immediately by a very large pit bull that charged at that officer. He discharged rounds that we know that the dog was struck and killed. At the same time, a male suspect came from around the back and started an open fire with a .357 Magnum revolver. That officer was struck in the shoulder. He went down, fell on the sofa in the living room, at which time a female suspect went towards that officer, reached over the officer, and started making a move toward his shotgun. At that time, backup officers, other officers in the staff that made entry, discharged their firearms, striking that female suspect.
That's obviously a terrible story for Rhogena Nicholas's family, her mother, Joanne Nicholas, back in Natchitoches, Louisiana, her brother, John Nicholas, here to here. And what's amazing is that given the physical findings that are now available, this is still the story that we've only heard from the City of Houston, and has caused the family to decide that they need to take this important next step. We also know that they didn't just end the story with describing these desperados in this incredible gunfight against a hero, Gerald Goins, and the other police officer. While the command staff, Chief Acevedo, sat there, we heard something even worse about Rhogena and her husband from the police union president, Ray Gamaldi.
We are sick and tired of having dirtbags trying to take our lives when all we're trying to do is protect this community and protect our families. Enough is enough.
Well, now we know because Michael Maloney and his team, and as you can find from the petition in his curriculum vitae, Michael Maloney is a former senior forensic examiner with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He's also a former instructor on scene examination with the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. What's also remarkable is, from as detailed by Mr. Maloney in the sworn verified petition today, is the extent of physical evidence which would need to be taken into account if we're to believe the story provided by the police department was left there to be recovered by him some 3.5 months after. What we know now is that Mr. Maloney, in actually preparing, is able to now confirm with a high degree of probability based on the physical evidence that I will detail for you as found by him and his team, that Rhogena Nicholas was shot by an officer standing outside to the right of the front door, firing through the wall and actually striking her as she's turned away from the door towards where her dead dog was found. We know this because when they conducted the forensic examination, they were able to actually track the gunshots that were in there. Mr. Maloney documented and confirmed that there were at least 12 shots through the wall to the right of the front door from a shooting position that would not be visible. In other words, a position where whoever's firing that weapon at that rate of fire would not be able to see anything Rhogena Nicholas was doing, much less wrestling with a police officer for a shotgun. We know that because as he tracked it, both with lasers and standard ballistic reconstruction, it lined up. But what's critically important at this point that we also know as of this week is that this particular bullet that was at least initially suspected to be the fatal bullet that was left unrecovered during the period of time that the Houston Police Department and whatever forensic examiners they chose to have there, Actually, at this point, we know for a fact, based on testing, and this is the actual bullet that we're talking about, has now, as confirmed by Mr. Maloney, by DNA testing where they actually took the time to compare a sample taken from the autopsy that was provided last week by the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences from the sample taken from Rhogena Nicholas during autopsy with the DNA that was the primary contributor on the bullet. What that confirmed with a high degree of probability, basic DNA matching is confirmed by the testing facility, is that that bullet that was left unrecovered that tracks with the firing position outside the host is the same blood match with DNA that was confirmed for Ms. Rhogena Nicholas. We also know that in this case, this story that this battle that was immediately happened that left these 2 civilians dead was very quick. As Chief Acevedo detailed, this happened at 4:30. We also know that based on the indications from the neighbor who recorded this cell phone video, that it was provided to the Texas Rangers within a week of the incident. What the cell phone video shows us is a couple things that also do not square up with the story that the Houston Police Department has pushed out since the beginning and left this family to carry. The first thing is that we now know, based on cell phone recordings taken by a neighbor, that this story that the shooting and the action was all done and these people within a very short period of time is not consistent with the cell phone video that was recorded that shows almost 30 minutes after the action was done, and presumably they were left dead at that point. There's 2 lone gunshots that there is no explanation at this point for.
Right there on the floor,
Within a minute of those 2 lone gunshots that came at least 30 minutes after at least what the Houston Police Department has indicated was the end of the gun battle, we heard this. We don't know exactly why, but we also know, and this is also extremely troubling to the family, notwithstanding that we now know from the cell phone video and the indications about what actually happened, that almost an hour later, what appears to be HPD negotiators are negotiating with the house at this gun battle that, at least according to Chief Acevedo and the Houston Police Department, had been over for an hour and a half. What that also tells us at this time is that when Mr. Maloney was able to conduct the scene examination over the course of 4 days with his team, also inconsistent with the indication that this was a gun battle done very quickly, was this finding we mentioned earlier about someone apparently at some point thereafter walking up to a back wall, shooting away from the front door and firing into the kitchen, or I'm sorry, the dining room wall towards the kitchen. And we can say this, and Mr. Maloney has confirmed this with a number of indications. First off, I'd like to note from the findings Mr. Maloney and was confirmed by the autopsy, Dennis Tuttle was approximately 14 feet from this location, which by the way is way in the inside of the house. It's approximately 21 feet from the front door as well. What we know is that this location is against a wall that also would not be possible to be fired into from someone inside the house or anywhere near the front door. And it was done, as we now know, with forensic testing within no more than, according to Mr. Maloney and the tester on this, 2 to 3 inches, where somebody went against this wall and fired twice for some reason that we still yet to know at this point. There's no indication at this point that, and we haven't heard this story, that Dennis Tuttle was somehow able to walk after he was shot and shoot a gun into a back wall on his own. But we do know that this testing location, which is off to the right away from the door, not accessible from the front door, indicated, at least on initial examination, gunpowder residue. So the question was, how do we confirm that this was gunpowder residue consistent with someone placing a weapon and firing 2 shots in quick succession? And that's why Mr. Maloney had some testing to determine, is that the case? What we now know from the chemical analysis taken from that particular location, it is confirmed by a chemical assay to have the presence of lead, which fully confirms for Mr. Maloney and any objective forensic scientist that this shot was fired by someone standing more or less adjacent to the wall. We also know at this point, and this is where our family focus is most directed, that why that house was chosen and how it was chosen, but more important, why in the world would an officer feel confident enough to swear to the existence of a drug sale? Why would this particular officer feel comfortable enough to swear that there was a drug sale with a non-existent confidential informant? And we know that at the time, the city and its command staff were very emphatic that this was the right house, that there had been an actual purchase of heroin in this heroin drug house that was feared by the neighbors.
Yeah, we actually bought black tar heroin at that location.
We know now from records we were able to secure in our investigation from other filings made involving other persons where there's an allegation that Gerald Goins had fabricated confidential informant information, that like any police organization, the Houston Police Department has rules about documentation of information provided by confidential informants. Those are done because if you're going to do it ethically consistent with legitimate police standards, there should never be a situation where you're trying to figure out who was the confidential informant that justified going in front of a judge and swearing that there was criminal activity before you knock down the door and start shooting. In this case, we know that this particular Houston police standard, and this is an exhibit to our petition today, documents that if they followed their requirements, which they know they had since at least 2003, any information that relays criminal investigation, and certainly the sale of black tar heroin would be that place, is required to be documented by the rules. It's not just required to be documented, it's also required to be witnessed by at least a supervisor or another officer, and then that documentation is contained within the files of the police department and its command staff that's accessible at any point in time. That's why in this case, we know that if the police department, which they clearly had access to, had no documentation, there was no confidential informant, there was no documented evidence of a heroin sale at that location in the file from Gerald Goins before he went there, there would be no reason for, in this case, as we now know from an affidavit of Officer Bass, one of the investigators, for a scramble at the same time the command staff was telling all of us here in Houston and the world that this was a confirmed drug house and we promised there was a reason to be there, for them to be scrambling around to identify a confidential informant. Lieutenant Marshal Todd and the other members of the command staff knew full well that it was their responsibility to make sure that that was the case. What this obviously raises is not just troubling questions about what was happening in this case and how easy it was for Gerald Goins to do what he did in this case, but how long and how many other Houstonians have been affected by this kind of conduct, which is why the family at this point has asked that we actually take the opportunity in the court to actually get down to not just what happened that day, but why has this been happening over and over again with Gerald Goins in this particular division. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck Bourque, who's joining us from Houma, Louisiana.
Thank you all for coming out today. We have the pleasure, Mike and I, of representing Joanne Nicholas, the mother of Rhogena Nicholas, and John Nicholas, the brother of Rhogena Nicholas. From the outset, what our clients have wanted is the truth to come out. Joanne Nicholas is in her 80s, lives in Natchitoches, Louisiana, communicated with her daughter on a daily basis. When she saw this article run, and when she first got the information that her daughter had been killed in this incident, and then watched as the news articles came out while her daughter's character was assailed repeatedly, she knew it wasn't true. An example, one of the things, and Mike, if you can blow up, from the beginning, whenever they've talked about who Rhogena Nicholas is, they hold up a picture of her from the Driver's License Bureau. Not a flattering picture at all. I asked you to look at some of the other pictures. The picture that was sent to her mom by Rhogena about 3 weeks before this incident happened. So from the beginning, it's been an attack on her character and telling these things that she supposedly did that her mother knew and her brother knew was not something that Rhogena would do. You take it forward, even as the police department was coming out and saying some of our initial statements weren't really right, or maybe this, or maybe that. Nobody's ever to this day from Houston Police Department bothered to call Rhogena Nicholas's mom, Joanne Nicholas, and say we're sorry. And that was one of the first things we did when we were retained, before anybody went public, before there were any newspaper articles run. March 19th, we drafted a very carefully worded letter saying, we know that this investigation is going on. We know that we don't know, or everything's not known, but certain statements that the police department made about Rhogena and her husband, Dennis Tuttle, about the presence of drugs that were never found, about everybody in the neighborhood fearing this couple, which nobody in the neighborhood feared the couple. We asked that some of those be retracted, just privately, call, say, and then prevent other information from being released. It's never occurred. So we're here today, and we're taking the steps we're taking today to help bring out the truth of what happened. And the primary driving force for Joanne Nicholas and John Nicholas is to find out what happened, how did Rhogena Nicholas get killed, and more importantly, to prevent any other families or any other members of this community from incurring or having to go through a similar tragedy. So that's what this is. It's a drive for the truth. We want to find out what's happened. We've tried every other method through public records requests and otherwise. The information hasn't been given. That's why we filed the pleading that we filed today, so we can begin conducting a formal legal discovery process so we can discover the truth.
So I'm just going to update you on the next steps that we anticipate in this continuing investigation. First off, there will be a hearing in front of the judge, Jerry Semino, to determine whether or not the family can continue with this formal deposition process for these depositions and documentation. One thing I would note is Chief Acevedo has publicly promised that there would be an audit of the Narcotics Division and their conduct. That's certainly something that at this point, almost 6 months afterwards, is long overdue, and we hope to be able to evaluate that to determine how consistent this was with the pattern and practices. In addition to the hearing, Michael Maloney and the other forensic team will continue their efforts. I can assure you that these two findings that were released and confirmed by Mr. Maloney are not the only ones that are going to be available to him based on his reconstruction. We would also hope that the investigating authorities at whatever level would assist in sharing the information they have, because we do know that having first been on the scene, Michael Maloney and his team are in the best position to assist to really discover not just these very basic issues that don't line up with the city's story, but evaluate how and why we heard this story for so long, some 6 months later. Thank you for your attention. We're happy to address any questions that y'all may have at this point.
First off, what's that?
The hearing's not set. That's going to be, we filed today. The court will have to give us a date. My expectation it would be the second week of September, but obviously that'll be the court schedule.
Those two shots that you're saying happened 30 minutes after, what is your theory? That it's staged to make it look like return fire?
Well, we're trying to avoid theories at this point. What we do have is a very troubling question of why were there, if the story we've heard from the police department is honest and true, why is all of a sudden there are two shots that are clearly on the video where they're saying two suspects down, and then by the way, we now know from forensic recreation and scene examination, somebody held a gun and fired 2 bullets into a wall.
Mike, Chuck, this has been described and categorized as a botched raid from the very get-go. Do you view this as a botched investigation as well?
Well, what we can say is this, and this is what Mr. Maloney has confirmed for us in what we filed today. If you're going to do a legitimate investigation and you're going to actually take any steps to question the narrative given by the police officers at the scene, you can't do it without actually gathering the evidence that he gathered, because you don't have any way of verifying unless you take the steps you need to actually see whether the story lines up with the physical evidence.
And Mario, remember, Mr. Maloney went in there over a month after this happened. He found over 10 rounds, 10 bullets that were fired on the day Rhogena Nicholas was killed, that the police department had already supposedly done their investigation. They weren't found. He found them. I think that speaks for itself.
This said, again, I will ask, do you view this as a botched investigation?
Put it this way, if the obligation that we all had and what we're promised was a full and complete investigation, I don't think there's any doubt that we haven't got it yet, and we still need it ahead of us. Particularly when we're able to affirm and confirm that the bullet that killed Rhogena Nicholas, because we know it from the DNA testing, was left there abandoned by whatever investigation was done.
And you're certain the bullet was fired, can you just repeat the part we talked about, why you thought the bullet was fired from the outside?
Right, so it's detailed in the petition and it's confirmed, and it's really Michael Maloney and his team that made this confirmation, and obviously he's the one that's entrusted and has done this across the world for federal agencies. But basically what they do is, in any ballistics reconstruction, is determine where there are bullets, do ballistics recreation by basically more or less laser sighting ballistics rods, using those methodologies, and now doubly confirmed by the DNA testing that confirmed the bullet that was suspected to have fatally wounded Rhogena Nicholas does in fact is the primary contributor on her DNA. That's a pretty solid basis for Mr. Maloney to make that confirmation, which is why he did it at this point.
And you look, and again, that's done by the testing. You look, this is the testing. These are the bullet holes outside of the house. These, using his equipment, which is used in conducting his investigations, he did determine the trajectory of these bullet holes. These were officers standing outside of the house at an angle that they could not see into the house, fired repeatedly on this side of the door and on that side of the door. He did his trajectory projections and determined it was one of those bullets that hit Rhogena Nicholas and caused her death.
Yes, sir.
Did you find any indication of fire coming from inside the house, out?
I can tell you that Mr. Maloney did not find and reported to us that he found no physical evidence. Now, obviously, these are preliminary findings, and what I do want to caution everybody about is it's certainly important, and it would be helpful, in fact necessary, to get the full story, to get whatever was taken, whatever was documented at the scene by the Houston Police Department and investigators and correspond. What he can say is, with this piece of the evidence, we know what happened more likely than not to Rhogena Nicholas.
For the record, the evidence shows that we got the prison report, and what we've already known shows that there have been false statements from the Houston Police Department officers, from at least, I'd say, 2 of them.
What I think we can say with confidence is the physical evidence, as confirmed by a well-respected forensic scientist, does not line up with the story we heard relayed by the police department for whatever reason.
So, you turned all this over to the DA's office, right?
Well, and to the district attorney's office credit, I mean, obviously they're continuing their investigation. I mean, we're now 6 months in. After it was identified that Mr. Maloney had made findings and retrieved physical evidence, they met with us, and we've actually already confirmed for them that the physical evidence, as well as documentation about how it was collected, is already going to be sent this week or within the next week to the district attorney's office.
So I guess in the whole, the district attorney's office supposedly has whatever information HPD has collected, bullets, whatever, various things. They have that, which you guys are not privy to, and then you gave them your set of findings where you're sharing now. So supposedly, in a criminal investigation, they should have both of these pots of information, which would supposedly, theoretically, they should have a fuller picture of what took place.
Well, I mean, I think obviously everybody's going to have a full picture when you take both the evidence that was gathered, no matter how incomplete, and whatever Maloney and his team gathered. Obviously, the more information, the better. Some of this information, as indicated by Ms. Maloney, that was left behind is critical. And I think it's incredibly important that they be put together, and that's one of the things that we're going to be requesting be allowed.
And so are the DA's office are the only folks who seem like both of these sets of information, because we don't have it, we've asked, we don't have access to it.
We do not have access to what the Houston Police Department gathered at this time.
But one of the purposes for what we're doing here today is to also include that information, because why it happened is really at the end of the day a big question for Joanne Nicholas and John Nicholas. But what we know to be false statements that don't line up with the physical evidence, taking away that smear on Rhogena is real important too.
Can we hear from the brother?
John would prefer not to answer any questions at this point, but if you want, John, you want to go ahead and say a few words?
As they said from the beginning, all I want is the truth, some kind of closure, hope this don't happen again, and hope the court will allow us to move forward with this investigation.
How far are you from the truth?
We're getting closer, looks like, from this end, but we're not sure on the other end.
How much faith do you have in HPD?
Hopefully they'll come up with the information.
What do you think about the information that you gathered about Rhogena being shot from the outside by people who killed her?
It's a shame you're sitting in your house, mind your own business, and somebody shoots you.
Can you explain to us a little bit about your sister's character? There's been some false narratives about her dealings. Would you like to clear anything up or tell us how she was on a day-to-day basis?
Well, look at it this way. I'm a first responder back in Louisiana. I go on these calls all the time. Most drug dealers and users don't look like she does in her picture. They wouldn't be texting or calling their mother 3 or 4 times a day. And I know that for a fact that she does that because I call my mama every day, and she always told me, I talked to your sister earlier, or she called me early this morning. From my experience being a first responder, I've never seen that happen.
And that's one of the first things, and John be here. First time I sat down with Miss Joanne, the first thing she did was take out her cell phone and say, my daughter sends me a prayer every morning, sends me several texts a day, calls me every day. This is not who my daughter is. Please help us find the answers.
And I'd ask John to share a little bit about what it's meant that this is now even 6 months into it and we're now uncovering this on his mother.
She said that she asked me all the time, saying, I hope I can make it. She's 85 years old. I hope I can find the answer and get her name clear before I pass. And hopefully getting this court probate, that might speed it up.
Mr. Nicholas, we know that HPD hasn't reached out to your family. In other cities, there have been mayors and offices of mayors that have reached out. Has Mayor Turner at all reached out to you?
No, we have not heard from him.
Surprising.
I guess he's a busy man. But if I was wrong, I believe I would call somebody and tell them.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Well, I remember there was some blood outside on the house, on the wall. Is there any evidence that there was shooting outside happening from, someone shot outside?
What I can tell you is that Mr. Maloney has a number of preliminary findings other than the ones that we shared today. That will continue. I do know that it would be best if what was recovered was able to be corroborated so that all these questions can be answered in a timely manner.
And are you guys, any thoughts on, have you guys talked to the feds or the DOJ about their side of the investigation? Like for investigating?
Well, I mean, we understand that they announced some months ago. I can say that at least since the announcement that the FBI or U.S. Attorney's Office was involved, there hasn't been any effort to actually evaluate the scene like Mr. Maloney has done.
What is your reaction to the fact that there's been grand jury testimony already involving HPD officers, federal level?
Well, I mean, I know that it's been reported. Obviously, I'm not aware because grand jury testimony is confidential. But to the extent that they're looking into not just what happened that day, but kind of this pattern and practice of what went on, particularly in the narcotics division, that's absolutely important for what we need to do.
On the first finding, I wanted to make sure I'm clear on something. Because according to HPD, the officers who were already inside fired on Ms. Nicholas and killed her then, but according to this analysis, that Bill shot came from somebody outside.
Right.
Correct.
But does this raise the possibility that they began firing even before they went in? Or?
What it says is whoever fired, and we now know with the DNA, at least what it confirms, is that whoever fired the bullet that was fatal to Ms. Rhogena Nicholas as she was facing away from the door, some 15 feet from the front door, could not see her.
It was fired from outside the house.
But dealing with the police officers inside when it happened, do you know? Is there
Where, at this point, there's a lot of unanswered questions. That's why it'd be important. We don't know fully what their story, but we know the story that we've heard is that an officer was inside and that she was fighting with an officer. What we know now is that whoever was firing that shot that killed her shot through a wall, couldn't see her, couldn't see that inside area. That couldn't line up with what they're claiming.
And listen, you know, you have a picture of Rhogena behind you that shows him, her with one of her dogs. Do you want to say anything addressing the whole allegation they have vicious dogs and the...
Yeah, we haven't heard the vicious dogs one. That's, I mean, and I think Chuck Bourque pointed out this, I mean, when you have a lineup and they're distributing grainy pictures from a driver's license that more or less looks like a mugshot, and obviously there's a reason why that's being done, that hurts every time the family members and the folks that know and love her see that.
And what is, you have not filed civil litigation for a time after that?
Well, at this point, I mean, and this is a family that wants to make sure that they're doing the right thing. I think everybody that knows them, that's really important. This step is one that state law provides for, allowing you to do an investigation to verify that before you go and sue someone, you have a basis for it, and that's why they've taken this step.
Was there any evidence gathered by the private investigator that would indicate that these officers who were shot through friendly fire?
Well,
We don't
know.
know.
Let me say at this point, there are some potential conclusions that Mr. Maloney has, but I think it'd be important to have the full evidence to look at, including what was gathered, what was not gathered, and put it together to make that determination.
And we don't have the information about where the officers were, the officers that were wounded, what rounds, what caliber ammunition they were wounded with. These are all things we're seeking. We don't have the information yet.
Mike, Chuck, after everything that you have put together here and in investigating this case, I want to go back to February 15th and what Chief Art Acevedo told me on that day. He said, we had a reason to be inside of that home. And this was after everything had been exposed about some issues with regards to narcotics officers. After everything you have seen and examined, is there any reason that Chief Art Acevedo and his HPD officers, as he indicated, had a reason to be inside that home?
You know, at this point, we're now 6 months, a half year later. They've given us stories. We've given us a number of stories, including the story about the fake sale of heroin. It's certainly possible that members of HPD, whether Chief Acevedo or anybody else, will come up with other stories, but we can't really speculate about why they would do that at this late date.
Is there any reason that you found?
We have found no reason.
Yeah. In other words, no, there's certainly an indication that there was a service call made. The family had asked for that documentation to be provided. That was blocked by HPD. There's so many questions that have been blocked by HPD to kind of verify. We do know, and that's why this is an important step, that at least the biggest parts of the story that they gave us that day and the days after don't line up with the evidence. So whether or not there's more stories we're going to hear, don't know.
Do you know if they did a gun residue test on Dennis Tubbs' hands? He said that he shot. So was there any evidence that he actually fired his weapon?
There is an autopsy that was done. My understanding, and this is something that I'll have to defer on, is that that kind of test, in other words, that somebody fired a gun as opposed to simply was in a room where a gun is fired, is really what we're talking about. So that would what the indication would be. I do know that the autopsy for Mr. Tuttle revealed that his right hand dominant was bandaged at the time with an ace bandage, some kind of problem he had with it that day. I'm sorry? His hand, yeah, at least from the indication from the autopsy report on Mr. Tuttle, and he was right-handed, according to the family, is that was bandaged up with an ace bandage. That's something that certainly would call into question that part of the narrative, but that's not something we're able to talk to.
The recovery of his gun didn't occur when their crime scene. Wasn't that picked up at a later date after the incident?
I apologize, right?
The gun was recovered by HPD.
We don't know. We don't know.
But not through the crime scene, was it done at a later time?
We don't know.
We don't know.
They haven't shared that.
Yeah. I mean, we know that, for example, whether Mr. Tuttle ever fired, whether there were 2 shots later in the wall, the timing of that, that's something at this point there's just really serious questions in the narrative that we've been given already. Yes.
2 shots were fired once. This one, do y'all know when those were fired after he was killed, or is that unclear at this point as to when?
Well, what we can tell you from the physical evidence and the cell phone recording is that after, at least according to the police narrative, they were dead, somebody fired 2 shots. We also know that there's physical evidence that somebody went inside the house at some point in time and fired 2 shots into a wall from a distance of 1 to 2 inches.
You don't have definitive times to when those 2 shots?
Well, if we accept the police narrative that Mr. Tuttle was killed at the get-go and he was found 15 feet away, it would certainly suggest that who knows?
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Mike Doyle. I'm a partner at Doyle LLP here in Houston.
Chuck Bourque. I'm a partner at the law firm of St. Martin and Bourque in Houma, Louisiana.
Sure. Mike, M-I-K-E, D-O-Y-L-E.
Chuck, C-H-U-C-K. Last name B-O-U-R-Q-U-E.
I do want to end one thing. The reason why, obviously, this story has continued is because of what it means to all the folks in Houston. The continued attention of so many Houstonians and the media in particular to keep making sure that this story is fully uncovered is incredibly important. We appreciate you staying after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.